You're more prepared than I am. I like never, ever have that ready.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to. I'm already holding them up, so I'll just hold them up, so I don't have to hold them up this entire time. I'm very proud to be moderating this adult fantasy sequel panel, in which, as you can all see, I have all of the books this time. It rarely happens, but it has happened, so I had to celebrate this canon event, and that's where they are. Um, as I said before, I am just so thrilled and just like have to sort of tamp down my own internal excitement over the amazing authors that we're going to be chatting about and the books, obviously, since I own them. Just a little note about me before we get started. My name's Lily. I'm the moderator for this panel, and I'm kind of like the person, I guess, behind Utopia State of Mind on the internet. So, next, we're going to have the authors introduce themselves, and then I'm going to be posing my questions, of which I had many that did not make the cut. And then if anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and I will try to remember to go up. And yeah, I think that's everything. So, Andrea, do you want to start with the intros?
Sure. So I'm Andrea Stewart, and I'm the author of the Drowning Empire series, which is epic fantasy that's set on an archipelago of migratory islands with bone magic.
Oh, it's me. Sorry. I am Nia Davenport. I am the author of the Blood Gift Duology. It is a science fantasy that's set in a secondary world. The society is hella sexist, racist. There's this black woman literally fighting for her right to exist. She throws a lot into these deadly military trials in order to figure out who murdered her grandfather.
And I can see her little Barbie in the back of your poster.
Murder Barbie.
And I am C.L. Clark, and I have my book. I'm the author of The Unbroken and The Faithless, which are the first two books in the Magic of the Lost trilogy, which is about a princess and a soldier who come from a colony and the empire respectively and have to figure out if it's worth working together or tearing each other apart, even if they kind of have the hots for each other. Yeah, in a nutshell, I'm sure we'll talk more about all of that later.
Sorry, I just said couldn't unmute myself. My first question is about action and battle scenes, mostly because I unfortunately am one of those readers who, like, when I read them, cannot picture anything. I just mind empty, brain off, basically. But I want to so badly. So my first question is, for those action scenes, how do you draft these, especially with the elements of magic, magical companions, these sort of things that are not daily, kind of abilities that we may possess. Andrea, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So this may be unsatisfying, but it kind of plays in my head like a movie. So, so I kind of see it in my head as a movie, and then I'm like describing what is happening in my head. I do try to think from the point of view of the character, as far as like, well, what kind of weapons do they have at their disposal? What is the environment like? So what are they going to try to do next, and what kind of challenges are they facing? I think about those things, but yeah, mostly it like plays like an action movie in my head, and I just write it down.
Same. So I recently realized that there are two different like types of readers and like writers, and everybody doesn't see like the narration as like these moving images. And I was like blown away, like, really? This is not the same for everybody. But for me, it is. I do find it difficult. Like sometimes, like I'm definitely like a vibes writer. So I'm like, oh, I want these vibes. And then I have to figure out like how to actually block out the scene. And then I like kind of lean in on like my theater major training a little bit and be like, okay, like let me like actually block out the characters and like, this is their physical positioning here. Like from one beat to another, but sometimes I'll be like so focused on I want my character like to be kicking ass that I'll forget that magic should like in addition to like the sword thrusts and like the punches and like the kicks or whatever, they have magic too. So we should like will that in. Or sometimes it'll be the complete opposite and like they'll be being a magical badass and I'm like we should actually get some physical fighting. So it's always like this dance for me to like go back and figure out like how to blend both.
I like that you added also the theater part because I'm a theater kid as well,
Oh,
and so that's it's like so it's I also see the movie reel, also practice blocking like a theater thing, but also I'm just like a very physical like embodied person, and I think very hard about the way things move physically in space, and so on one hand having non-tangible magic actually is like, well, shit, what does it do? Like, how does it move? If I can't touch it, what is it doing? And so my cheat is actually that like the magic that is most prominent currently in books 1 and 2 requires physical touch, and then it goes through the body. And so I drew a lot on my like my own knowledge of anatomy and stuff from you know just my own studies and stuff. So I know what a human body should do in theory. But one of the I had this conversation a lot because I'm friends with a lot of writers who hate action scenes, absolutely hate it, and I'm like, oh my god, these are the best things ever. And so they always laugh at me because I say that action scenes and sex scenes are the same thing. They're the same thing, because it's about like some few concrete movements, and sometimes they're not always that different. They use like the exact same words in a lot of cases. um, and the main point of the scene is very often not the action, but how the character feels about the action, either during or after. Sometimes a long time after, and what kind of consequences it has on the narrative. And so one of the things I like to think about is first I'll often do like a very full like, and then he punched him, and then she kicked him, and then she stabbed him, and it's like if you read just kind of like a bunch of random note cards of actions. But then in revisions I will cut out like half of those and replace them with the actual emotions that the character's going through, and so enough that I leave enough that we have a sense of the physicality, and the reader can fill in some more gaps like, I'm going to assume that she is still punching and kicking him, but we don't need to see all of them because right now she's having some angst and we're going through that at the same time. And sometimes it's supposed to be a fast action, and so we, like hit, punch, kick, no emotions, and then we like decompress in a later scene. But that's kind of how I try to think about them or go through them.
Yeah, I love what you were saying about melding kind of the emotional component and the mental component with also the physical component. I think that that really grounds it, and that's those are the only I think fight scenes where I'm able to like visualize it a little bit better because I didn't realize this until literally a couple months ago, but there are like people who really cannot visualize things. And that was revolutionary realization for me. But anyway, my next question is I wanted to know if you all learned anything with this recent release, which you may have. Sorry, I'm reading the question that I wrote, and I realized that I think I made a typo in there. Anyway, what I meant to say was, with this recent release, did you learn anything different or more in general than you did with your first release or your previous release? Nia, do you want to start?
Yeah. So my recent release was the sequel that wrapped up a duology, and it's one of those things that like a lot of publishing advice it really drove home. You have to take it with like a grain of salt because there's so much advice that says don't write a sequel until you sell book one because so much might change and then like you've written a sequel and you can't use it. So normally I don't follow the advice as like a hard line, and I do what I want. But for some reason, my brain like stuck on the don't write a sequel until book one sells. So I never attempted to write a sequel. And then I had to like write a sequel and was like, oh shit, I don't know how to write a sequel, because I've literally like writing is a skill. And for me at least, and like I practice it, and like as I write more and play around with like craft, it like it like I like hone it and it gets better. And I was like, I literally have never attempted to like bring all these all these vibes and cool plot points I set up in book one, and like bring them all the way through like a fulfilling conclusion. And so it took me a minute, and it took me many calls with my agent and my editor to like figure it out. And be like, okay. And I was never a plotter until I had to plot book two, because I was like, I don't know what the hell I'm doing, and now I must plot in order to like make this make some type of sense. So for me, it was like learning. I learned how to plot and not be a total pantser. And I learned how like a lot of the things that like get set up in book one, how to like really like bring them full circle in book two, and pretend like I meant to do that in book one when it wasn't just this epiphany in book two. Like, oh, this will be cool. And then I learned that my readers get really upset. Like, there are some characters you kill off, and they're like throwaway characters for like, and not to like think that they're going to be throwaway characters for everybody else, because that's not always the case.
Who did you kill? Don't. Okay, we'll come back to that later.
Okay.
Yeah, first off, I mean, I'm jealous of both of you actually for being done with your series. But doubly you, Nia, for having finished already at the second. I think though, it's hard for me to say what I've learned, because I find it to be just such a continual process all the time, no matter what I'm writing. Like I'm concurrently writing a novella right now as well, and I'm learning so many things about like writing from that process. Like each story is teaching me something different. But definitely learned to outline and to write. I don't know how long it took you guys for your second book, because I think like this was everybody's second book, like in this series, maybe in terms of like publishing. And writing that second book that is not only your first sequel, but also just your second book ever. So it's also usually the first time you're on publishing schedule type deadline. That was ridiculous. It continues to be ridiculous. I don't. I mean, like even for the third book at the same, like writing the third book at a similar pace, is just, oh man, that's fucking nuts. That's freaking nuts. Like, I don't know how people are supposed to write a book so fast. So like The Faithless was indeed pushed out, so it came out 2 years after The Unbroken. But I guess part of what I learned from that is just like the book takes the time it takes very often, and I am capable of writing faster than I wrote The Unbroken. Like The Unbroken was many, many, many drafts. I think by the time I sold it, I sold it at draft 5 over the span of almost 10 years. And like lots and lots and lots of people had seen it. Like classmates, professors, my agent, we did a pass together. And so to come from that entire like village, having worked on a novel for so long, to having me and my editor and maybe my agent gets a quick look at it, but not for an in-depth like full pass like she did before we sold the book. I really had to deal with a lot of just, and continue to deal with a lot of self-doubt about whether or not enough people have weighed in. Like, is this the best version of the book? And to be honest, I'll never know, because I hit a deadline and I was done. And I was like, you know what? I'm happy with this, and so we're going to send it out. But if I'd held on to the book for another 10 years, who knows what it would have been. Luckily, I think it was pretty good. And I think from that, I also learned confidence in my work and ability to create something that I'm really proud of, and that doesn't necessarily take quite so long. And that transferred well to the third book, which I'm also really, really proud of, and maybe wrote a little faster than The Faithless. So
Yeah, sure. Don't envy me. I tossed like 165,000 words on that third book and started it over. So, yeah. Every time that I see like reviewers and like readers be like, oh yeah, like the sophomore slump is real and the second book is not as good as the first and so on. I'm like, have pity on us poor souls. Like, yeah, like Nia, I'd never written a second book as well. Like, and then of course with my last book, I'd never written a third book in a trilogy. It was always like I always knew that I liked the structure of a trilogy, but I'd only written like first books in trilogies, and that was the one that I sold was my seventh manuscript. So it's like by the time I got there, I was like, oh yeah, I can write a first book. Like, I thought I had like the whole writing a book process down. I was like, oh yeah, I got this, because like I wrote it in 3 months, and I didn't have to do a lot of revisions. But then I hit book two, and I was like, oh god, like I gotta like keep doing this, and also like connect it to book one, but it's also got to be connected to book three, which I haven't written yet. So I definitely learned a lot about structure, like not just structure over one book, because I feel like I had that for book one at least, but structure over like a sequel. What is that? And then also the structure of a trilogy itself. Like I definitely like learned a lot by writing that last book. And I hope it'll like carry over into my next series. We'll see. I don't know. I haven't hit book two in that yet. So it could be another disaster. I don't know.
one thing that really helped me in the writing of the second and now the third is Fonda Lee of the Jade City trilogy, for folks listening. Did a like a workshop online about writing trilogies, and it was brilliant. It made so much of it make sense to me that I was able to actually, like, it gave me the confidence to write on. So if you guys are out there writing your trilogies, try and find access to that. Go to her class, because she knows what she's talking about.
Oh, Fonda is incredible. Like I read her Greenbone Saga, and I was like, no notes, no notes, perfect, ended perfectly. It's perfect. Yeah, she knows what she's doing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely a fellow lover of the Greenbone saga. And I feel like when people ask me about it, I feel like one of the things that I love, or I think a succinct way I have of explaining like the scope of the trilogy, at least for me, is that it like pans out. And I feel like that will makes more sense maybe if you've read it, but like the idea that the scope and the world and stuff, it kind of evolves from this central core. But yeah, love those books so much. I had a question for you all, and this one is about continuing a series and trying to manage sort of literary feedback, reader expectations, kind of like all the other voices in your head. Because I think something that's already been touched upon in the panel so far is that your first book, you have so much more space and more time to develop it, and then balancing all of these other suddenly hundreds, maybe thousands of voices all at once that are starting to tell you all of these other things about your work and everything. How do you balance that while you continue producing work like that is continuing this this sort of storyline, this world, these characters? Sherry, do you want to start?
I have been thinking about this question on and off, like for my entire career, but also like since you sent the question. And I don't really have any one good answer, because obviously I see them, even the ones that I don't want to see or I don't go looking for, because like the Twitter algorithm, if you like certain things, it shows you certain things. And I'm in all the Gideon the Ninth fandoms, I'm in the Baru fandom, so obviously I see people talk about The Unbroken as well, because it sits in that same realm. Sometimes it's great, sometimes it's less great. And so on the one hand, like I write because I publish because I like people to read my stuff, and so it is nice sometimes to know that I'm on the right path for somebody, and that is one of the things that does keep me going and keep me writing. Um, but then there are the other comments. Uh, and I think part of the way I manage to deal with them and how much I take into account depends largely on how much I respect or give credence to those views. Randos on the internet, I don't respect them. I don't need to know them. I don't care about them. They don't know. I don't know them. And I certainly don't know their credentials for critiquing me beyond I read some books, or not even some books. I read one book, and maybe I read one book and I hated it, and it just happened to be The Unbroken. And I'm like, well, what can I do about that? I don't really value your opinion enough to change how I'm doing stuff. So sometimes I kind of facetiously answer this question like I'm just I have I'm too arrogant. I have too great a sense of self to deviate from my vision to appease some random person on the internet. And it's more complicated than that, but that's the short answer. Is I know what I want to write. I know what I want to do, and sometimes maybe like I'll add like a little like fan insert thing here in a later book because I know they like something in the second book, but that's mostly just Easter eggs for the people who I really do appreciate coming to find the work.
Yeah, I know the common wisdom is like, oh, like don't read your reviews and all that, but like I don't think there's anybody out there that's like just put themselves in that kind of locked box where they never read or happen across any kind of reviews. Like I feel like that's really unrealistic. I mean, don't drink from the fire hose that is Goodreads, of course. but
I drink
but
sometimes.
oh yeah, haven't we all? Haven't we all been like, I'm strong enough, and been like, I will face the fire hose just to see what it's like. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't recommend it, but I mean, you're probably gonna do it, right? so, so I think like maybe the better advice is like, how do you deal with that? Because it's not something that people avoid. I think unwisely or wisely. I mean, for me, like Sheree said, like I had a pretty clear vision from the start of the basic beats of what was going to happen in the story, and I wasn't really keen on deviating from that just because it was what felt right to me. And the fact is, you're never going to please everybody. Everybody's going to have certain expectations, especially after you write that first book. They're going to think it goes in a certain direction because that's their experiences and that's like that they've drawn upon from whatever background they have or whatever reading that they've done, that they're like, this is what I think should happen next. And people are going to disagree. So really you have to just write for the people that are going to agree with you, right? That's how it goes. I mean, there have been the times where I have like read what somebody was expecting and I was like, you know what? I agree with them. And that's like the hardest, right? Because you're like, oh, it's like shit, I should have done that. Um, but that's unfortunately like that's life, right? I say that I am always happy with what I put out there, but I'm never satisfied with it. And I think there's a difference because you're always going to be improving, hopefully, or at least that's what we tell ourselves, or I don't know if we keep writing. And what you're going to put out there is something that you may not be like satisfied with, in the sense that it's never going to really match exactly what you see in your head. And that's like the hard thing I think about writing, is because we always have this beautiful grand vision in our heads, and then when we put it down on the page, it's always slightly different. And that's like always like a little bit dissatisfying, but you can't quite get it there. But you have to be happy with it because otherwise like you'll never put it out. So so that's kind of like how I feel about this thing with like expectations, is that you kind of just have to be a little bit self-contained about it. Yes, I've seen some people read the first book and say like, oh, like I hope that we see more of this in book 2. And I'll be like, yeah, actually, I probably should put that in book 2. But for the most part, for the big, broad, general strokes of the series, I don't let it sway me. That way lies madness. Because you don't want a book written by a committee, right?
I'm that author who, when the Blood Trials was first coming out, I was like, I am strong enough. I can look at reviews. hubris always comes before the fall. I'm that person that was like, I have a thick skin, I can take it. And then I learned that I am a fragile creative now. And no, I don't have a thick skin and I cannot take it. But I also learned that for every like negative like critique I read, there was like a positive, like somebody else loving that same aspect, and like seeing that is what made me like really just be like Andrea said, it's impossible to please everybody. And then I kind of just like drowned out the background noise. And I wrote the blood trials like first and foremost like for myself as a reader, because it was rep I wanted in a certain type of story that like I wasn't seeing a ton of growing up. So I was like, I'm writing this story and it's a labor of love, and I'm putting all of the fantasy tropes that I've ever been wild about my entire life in this story. And so it was first and foremost for me, and then I was just like so incredibly thrilled to see that so many readers connected with it too on that same level. So when I was writing the like the blood gift, if I kept anybody in mind, it was definitely like the readers who took the time to like DM me or like at me or like have a conversation with me and tell me how meaningful the book was to them, and point out certain aspects or tropes that like really stood out. And so I definitely took that with me into drafting book 2, and tried to still like I guess pay like proper like respect or like homage or whatever to like those readers who have been ride or die for Akina since the very beginning. um and I feel like it translates well, because I feel like a lot of the people who love Ken are on my same like shenanigan wavelength anyways. So it helps to just like write the blood gift for me first and foremost, with like all again just the recipe of all the tropes that I love and get a good cackle over. And then like I always say that Akina has like the best like readers, because like I said, we're always like on this wavelength as far as this is like and so writing it for me just really is my recipe for like the people who the book is for. They will find it and it will resonate with them. And I try not to dwell on or think too hard about everybody else who might be like, this isn't for me, and that's okay. Every book is not for everybody.
Yeah, for the people that do drink from the fire hose, I always suggest doing like the 1-star therapy. Like go take a look at like a book that you love and look at the 1-star reviews because
I
that really helps.
I go find a New York Times best-selling book that has made millions of dollars and go look at the 1 stars, and I'm like, see, it literally doesn't even matter.
See, but sometimes that makes me mad. Sometimes I'm like, ugh,
Mm.
ugh, ugh. You see, my
You're
book
like,
doesn't have that problem.
You're like, that opinion's wrong.
Oh man, I don't mind the fire hose because like I look at the good ones and I see a couple bad ones, but after a while, it just like you like even the good ones kind of blur, because as nice as they are to see, they like you just kind of see like these are people who are in this camp and these are people who are in this camp, and they just kind of like diverge in two separate but like very contained places. And I'm like, all right, cool, fine. I have seen literally everything that someone can say about my book. Nothing can hurt me now. And that's fine. Once you get over it, it's done. Now you don't have to go look anymore either.
Okay, I have a few questions that are kind of like delving into some themes or characters, within the books. So the first one I have, or the first question that I have, is regarding all of your books. So in your books, your characters really have to grapple with power and responsibility, and I think that one of the things I've really enjoyed about all of your series is the way that that theme or that interaction evolves throughout the books, um, and sort of politics, diplomacy, sort of like strategy games that might not be on the battlefield, all of that kind of stuff. And I would love if you could talk about the differences your characters face in strategy meetings, politics, and whatnot versus on the battlefield, and sort of what characters or side characters you're able then to bring out a little bit more in these different settings than you might not be able to do on the battlefield, if that makes any sense. Andrea, do you want to start?
Oh, sure. This is a hard question because as much as I love writing politics, I feel like writing battle scenes is just so much easier. It's like so much more straightforward because you have people who are in outward conflict and there's no like maneuvering, or at least like, because the thing with political scenes is that people always have a thing that they're trying to get on the surface, but then they have like this underlying motivation that they also have, and then you have another character who's got that. So there's like a lot more like intricacies, and the way that they interact has to be really, really thought out. so so I always find that difficult. Okay, wait. So you're talking about okay, the differences that they face. I'm like going back to the question because like, oh crap. Yeah, so I think that the differences are that it is a lot more complex than what's happening in the battlefield, because you may have somebody that is against you that you can't just beat into submission, which is what happens on a battlefield. You have to try to come to some sort of agreement in some way, or you have to try to intimidate them in some way, and you're not using your weapons. I think like, so like in my books, like there's this whole thing about like you're not supposed to touch your weapons at like the dinner table, or which is where they do a lot of their politics, because that's like thought of as really uncouth. Because it's not about that. It's more about, what do you have that I want? What are you going to do that I want, or how do I make you do what I want? So it's just much more complex, and I think my characters, like, they really have to have their wits about them, because I think a decision made politically can have greater ramifications than one on the battlefield, because it's like some of the things that you do politically have a lot more unforeseen complications. If you make a mistake on the battlefield, it's like, okay, people die. If you make a mistake politically, it's like, yeah, that can also be the effect, is that people die, but it could also be that you make an enemy of somebody that you weren't intending to, or you mess up your economics. Like, it's just, yeah, it's just a lot more sophistication with that, and I definitely find it harder to write. And I think part of what I have to do a lot of the times is just really figure out exactly who the person is, what their motivation is, what they're going to say their motivation is, and then figure out how the characters are going to interact based on that. I think you were also asking about like, oh, what kind of side characters were you able to emphasize? Oh yeah, like in my second book, like Lynn has to basically do a little tour of the islands because she's got to solidify her claims to power. So sorry, that's my other cat. And so that allowed me to kind of bring in some of those side characters, like the governors of the islands, and try, like, figure out like, well, what are their motivations, and what do they want from her, and what do they not want to happen. So yeah, that's like my rambly political answer.
I love how I get the eyebrow. I don't know. So from the beginning, Akenna was set up to where she was always going to be a character where traits women typically get labeled with as like being flaws was supposed to be her strength, like from the very beginning. So like, yes, she's brash, yes, she's incredibly reckless, yes, she is wild, yes, she is furious. I'm like, yes, she is absolutely the type to like strike first and like think about the ramifications later. But she grows in that and figures out how to leverage it like as like a strength. So like on like the battlefield, Akenna is definitely like my general that you call in when you're like, we need like somebody who's going to like bring like this like brutal fight and just wreck house. And so like that is her strength on the battlefield. She is the one that like comes in at like maximum force, and like gets the job done or whatever it is. And then book two is all about tossing her in like the political arena and her having to like sink or swim and figure her shit out, and being like, when I'm like on the battlefield, or I'm like physical, I'm in like a physical fight, like like I know like I have my opponent beat, so like I can like just act first and think later because I'm like I'm gonna come out on top anyways. But like you said, like sometimes like the political like fumbles can have greater ramifications than like a blip on the battlefield. And so book two is about Akenna figuring out how to be as badass as she is in like the political arena. And maybe like having to find some chills sometimes. So like you can like strike the greater blow later. And so I really like threw her in those uncomfortable positions where she had to do some politicking and she had to exercise some decorum, even though she hates it. She hates that word. She can't stand that word. But she had to figure it out and learn that. And I think it brought in some really fun opportunities to like throw in some side characters. Like one of the characters I really had fun like balancing against Akenna is like Reed. Like that's like my romantic arc too, but also like if she's the reckless like general that like comes in with like maximum force, like he's the general he's always like thinking strategically and thinking politically. So book two, it was a lot of fun to really like build them up as like this incredible powerhouse unit. There's also like that found family arc of book two as like well. So we get like Danica and Haynes. And there's this really cool like queen and even a cartel boss that ends up on Akenna's side as like her allies. And these are all people that they have the same attitude as she does as far as like this major like fight me energy, and like they're very stubborn and set in their ways. And Akenna has to learn how to navigate these people who are as stubborn as she is. Johnny was another one, the warlord who comes back in. Akenna has to learn how to navigate people who has those same traits as she does, and seeing like without like being like, okay, you can't kill them because you need them, or you can't say something that alienate them, or like turn them from your side because you need them for the greater good.
Sometimes they're just bigger. So Terrain has a very similar arc. So in the first book, we find out that we've got this soldier kid who's very brash, very impulsive, and so she has a general, and by general I mean like a small amount of political savvy that you very often get as a marginalized person moving in non-marginalized society. Like you kind of learn to look around and sort of see whether you're safe or not, who you need to like bow a little bit to keep yourself out of trouble. It's like Terrain is definitely someone who has learned that through her like being raised in Balladeer, the colonizing empire country. But she's also a bit of a hothead. Like out of her soldier friends, that's kind of how she is known. But she is not as hot-headed as some others, to put that out there. And so then in the second book, she has never been in any kind of noble company, and she is now technically a member of a ruling council for a newly sovereign country, and she's hanging out with all of these new noble side characters. And she's like, I don't know what to do. And like half the time she's just like, can I punch them? Because I would really just like to punch them. And then Luca, who is the political character, is like, no, please, God, don't punch them. And so there are some lessons that she has to learn. And yeah, politics are so hard to write. And I'm revising book 3, which also has a fair amount of politicking. And I'm like, every day I'm just like, what if I just cut all of these out and put them in the trash forever? No more politics, only battle scenes. But that also, one of the things that I've been trying to deal with is do I have enough characters to make the political maneuvering work right? Because you need enough people to want things that they can cause trouble with other people wanting things. And so it gets very complicated, especially when you're in the third book and don't really have time to just invent entire new characters who feel well lived in and who have been obviously here for the entire 3 books. Like, didn't you notice them? Um, that kind of problem is something that I have, but um, I did really, really enjoy making new characters like Sabine, one of my favorites. She's the charming, noble, debonair, like basically everything you imagine when you think of as a rake. Um, and then part of the 3rd book and my struggle with all the characters is making every character do as much duty as possible, like double duty, triple duty, quintuple duty, whatever. Um, and actually, I struggle a lot with how things work. So I'm gonna steal something that Andrea said about like remembering that it's not like whatever they want on the surface is not what they're saying out loud. Like so like I know that I understand it when I read it. I understand it when I'm having conversations with real people. Like I don't know why I can't write it, but I can't. So I'm gonna take this away and spend, oh God, I don't know how many more weeks. I'm gonna go fix it. The 3rd book is gonna be great, guys. I promise.
The worst is when you're writing something that a character said on the surface and you forgot that's not what they actually meant. And you're like, wait a minute. This
Well,
doesn't
sometimes, yeah, like I'll go back and I'll be like, I'll change it because I'm like, oh, that's not what she wants. I'm like, oh, no, 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 wait, that's not what she wants. And they're not supposed to know that. Okay, so I have to go back and change it again.
good times, good times.
Mm.
Yeah, that is something that I do think about in terms of writers and series and multiple characters and everything, how you keep everyone's many secrets and lies and, like everything set in your head as you keep drafting. If we have time, maybe I can ask that later, but that is something that I think about all the time when I read these books. And I'm like, wow, there's a lot. And I can never imagine, the amount of post-it notes I'd have to have all over my house to balance all of it.
No, we are just so big brained. It's just all in here, just all only here.
Yeah, no, I have like a bunch of conspiracy looking maps in PowerPoint. It's basically what I do. It's terrible.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that I'm also one of the people who has like an Excel sheet, but then an Excel sheet for that Excel sheet because I've lost the plot. I'm like, I don't even remember what's going on in this first one, so I need a second one to like decode what I meant in that first one. So that's why I'm just like explosions in my mind when I read the books. Um, just a reminder as well, if anyone has questions, drop them in the chat. We have a few ones as well, but I have a few that like questions that I just really need to ask. So I will get back to them. And the question that I have is that let me scroll back up. Okay. So for your characters in The Faceless and The Blood Gift, they have to figure out sacrifice and power, how much to sacrifice for power, and their relation to power and systems in general. So I would love to know how you both approach this theme, especially within the context of a sequel. And I guess if you think your main character's ideas of power change throughout those 2 books. Nia, do you want to start?
Ooh, that is a hard question. Okay.
Mm.
Okay, sacrifice versus power. Definitely an intentional theme. I think I approached it. I hope I approached it. I think at the beginning, Akenna is a little bit of a spoiled brat. Like that maybe like her one like character flaw that was not meant to be a strength and is not a strength. It's something she has to like get smacked in the face with and get over because even though she is this woman who is like oppressed in many ways and marginalized in like many ways, she sits at this axis of like oppression and power because she's incredibly wealthy and her grandfather was like like the commander in chief or the leader of this entire nation, and so that gives her a certain level of like influence that like others who look like her may not have or don't have in that world. And she's used to being coddled by him and literally having everything handed to her, at least by him, and being like in this little protective bubble growing up, like nobody fuck with her or you have to deal with me. And then once she's old enough and she can like defend herself, like she's such a strong fighter that like she gets like this second added layer of like protection, because she's like, you know, you got to get through me first, and then if I don't mess you up, then my grandfather is coming. And so at the beginning of book one, he gets completely like snatched away from her with his death. And then again, I'm talking, I'm like, I've lost the question. Power and sacrifice. There we go. So Akenna has to learn like what sacrifice means, and I don't think she actually really truly starts to learn it until like the end of book one, where we see the sacrifices her grandfather made so that she could stand in her power that would have been stripped from her otherwise. And then book two is, you know, it goes back to like that Spider-Man adage, like with great power comes great responsibility, but also absolute power can corrupt absolutely. So Akenna has to figure out what she's willing to sacrifice in order to change the world or remake the world, and not like and not sacrifice so much as far as not necessarily with herself but like for the world, because there's always going to be casualties in like war. So, you know, not sacrifice so much that she becomes the same variety of monsters that she's trying to like topple, as far as when she's making these political like decisions, as far as like who to back and like what to protect and like what to fight for and like what to like allow to be a casualty.
I feel like Terrain and Echidna would be friends.
I feel like they
Or
would be,
maybe they would hate each other because they're too similar.
I don't know.
But I think they would be buddies.
I feel like they would be buddies and they would be a problem.
Yeah. So Terrain sits at a similar kind of junction of oppression and power. As a colonial soldier, she's like at the bottom of the empire, but she is now at the top of the colony. Like she has that kind of power. Among other of the local natives, she sits, at least in her mind, above them, and she has like weaponry and training, physical training that they don't have. And so she's very used to having a sort of physical prowess. But I think when I was writing The Unbroken, one of the things I was most interested in is what people who sit at that particular nexus do with what power they have, and how they climb for more, if they climb for more, what kinds of more power are appropriate or acceptable to them. And there are other Sans, other conscripts who think differently about what kind of power they would be willing to take. Like when Terrain starts at the beginning of The Unbroken, she's like, yes, I will take that Balladeran power. Absolutely. And some of her friends are like, I guess, sure. And some of them are like, hell no. Don't you touch it. I would die. I would starve to death before I like accepted that kind of power. And so there's a lot of that discussion in the book, like through different characters, I think. I don't know that I would say directly to so-and-so's idea of power change throughout the book. I'm very interested in seeing how people think, especially by the end of the third book. But we get to, so I guess spoilers, close your ears, guys. We get to the end of The Faithless, and Terrain has now had two very different kinds of power. She's had physical power, and she's had political power, like militaristic power and political power. And we see at the end that she is poised to have all the power that she ever wanted in Balladeran terms. And some people that she admired would potentially be disappointed in her depending on how she carries forward. And so she kind of has to figure out, is that power worth it for what it can do? Or is it not? Or can she turn dirty power into something that is still beneficial? And similarly, Luca is asking herself the same questions. She's asking herself, if I have all of this power, Like I am who I am, but can I do something good with it, or is it just dirty, all of it? And that's kind of the question that we're going to go through all the way to the end of the third book. So I'm not going to spoil you guys for that excitement, but I think the thing that I'm most interested in is that character growth, human growth is not linear. We might learn something about ourselves and be like, yeah, I am going to be a better person. And then you're handed like, but if you do this, and you're like, oh, I do want that thing. And so you might go for that thing, and all your character growth is out the window. And so we don't often know until we're faced with that temptation. And sometimes we fight the temptation the first time, but maybe not the second time, or maybe not the third time. And so I'm interested in exploring that conviction, I guess, or under what circumstances we might be willing to take dirty power or not.
Yeah, and I also love how in The Faithless, the way that you interact power and also constraint, and not only constraint, like you're constraining yourself maybe from using that power, but also forces or abilities that act upon you with newfound power, where you're like, oh, wait, actually, I may not have this power I thought I had, or I may not have as much power as I thought I had.
I completely forgot about the magic stuff. Whoops. Also, there's magic, and that requires sacrifice, all of it. And some people are willing to make the sacrifice, and some people sacrifice too much. And so, I'll stop there.
Okay. For Andrea, I want to ask about Jovis in the Bone Shard War. Maybe this is really cruel, but I cried multiple times reading the Bone Shard War, so I just feel like I need to ask this before the panel's done. I want to know, so I won't obviously ask you to disclose spoilers because that's not very nice, but I want to know how much you know about a character's arc basically before drafting. And you talked a little bit about knowing kind of like basic beats beforehand. And I also want to know, were there any of the POV resolutions in the Bone Shard War that were harder to write than you expected?
His was definitely the hardest to write. So I'm like trying not to be too spoilery or anything, but like I definitely like strongly really enjoy a bittersweet ending because I feel like there's always a cost when you have a fight that's that big, especially with epic fantasy, that, you know, we can have a happy ending in some way, but there is always something that we have to sacrifice for it, right? So, I mean, I knew what was going to happen with him, and it made sense to me just from where he had come from in the beginning, where he doesn't care about about the world at large. He's really just focused on his personal goals, and to that he goes to the end of book 3 where he is willing to do anything for the world and is like willing to put aside his personal goals. And a lot of it to me was that question of like, well, like what makes somebody a hero, right? And for him, like he's constantly, he gets to that point where he wants to be a hero, right? But sometimes like you get caught up in other things and you may not always act in a heroic way, and does that mean that you're not a hero anymore? And does that mean that you can no longer do things that are heroic? So like that to me like was his whole struggle, and I knew like this is how it had to end based on that, and this is where like I had to take his character. So so yeah, that's like that was my thought process on that. As far as was there anyone that was like harder to write than that? I don't. That was like the most difficult for the POV. Definitely that was the most difficult one.
Yeah, I think that is such a great, and that I think is one of the beautiful ways that the Bone Shard War sort of finishes that kind of theme that you've been kind of weaving and talking about throughout this whole thing about power and leadership and heroicism, that's the word, and the way that all three of those kind of interact in this, that triangle where you move a little closer to one but you move farther from the other, and like how do you reach this kind of sweet spot for your own person.
Yeah, because I feel like, especially with the internet nowadays, there's a lot of this kind of purity culture going on where it's like, well, you have to be perfect at all of these things and you have to perform in these certain ways. Otherwise, like, you can get piled on for one reason or another. And does that mean that like you're bad? Or does that mean that like, you should stop trying, right? And yeah, so I think a lot about these things, and this was definitely like a struggle that I wanted to address in some way.
And we have a few questions in the chat, but the one that I want to end our panel with is bringing it back to the beginning. So, what made you start writing? And I think the second question is kind of like, why did you choose, or why did you query, I guess, like this specific project, this specific book? Sheree, do you want to start?
Why did I start writing? I wrote because I really want, it was like this or acting. Like I really just wanted to pretend to be somebody else, and that somebody was somebody who rode horses and had a sword. I have swords now. I don't have a horse. So the easiest way is still currently for me to write. But if anybody is casting, I'm here. I'm ready. I'm willing. Like I will be an extra in the Riders of Rohan. Hit me. Um, but as far as this project, it was the project I wrote like my first nano book like a million years ago. It just wasn't good, and I didn't think it was what I was gonna stick with. And I had a novel before that I never finished, and this was the first one that I was like, this is the idea I have. This is the story I want to tell, and so I wrote it to the end, over and over and over again. And it wasn't until like I started querying around like maybe the third or fourth draft, and that I was like, okay, this is for real how you do this thing. And that's when also you're starting to get rejections. So you're like, well, maybe I'm not good at this thing, or maybe this project is not the project. But I never had a rejection that totally made me think that the idea of the Unbroken was flawed, and I also knew that it was like there was something there. I'd finished my first. I finished a couple drafts of the Unbroken before I found the Trader Baru Cormorant, and then I read it and I was like, oh my god, somebody wrote my book. They hadn't, but it was close enough that I realized like, no, people will buy this. Like somebody wants this because I want more like this. And Baru was also still kind of new in that it was queer and political and tragic before we got like the real like the new tragic queer. And it was, but I knew that it was going to be a thing, and now it definitely is a thing. But it was like there was something that I knew that this was it. Like I'm going to write this until it's done. And then even when I was like, no, really, I think we should. If nobody picks it up on this new revision, like revision 5, then I'm gonna trunk it and maybe come back later. But I had a friend who was just like, don't you fucking dare! This is the one. Do it one more time. Don't hold anything back this time. And I was like, fine. And there, now here it is. Yes,
Oh,
you
is it
need to
my
read
turn?
Baru.
Or okay. Um, okay, yeah. So why do I write? So or when did I start writing? Like like Sheree, I have like a whole line in my bio about how like my dreams of dragon slaying didn't pan out, and like so I guess I'll just be a writer. I remember being like, oh, when I got my laser eye surgery, I was like, well, now I can go through a portal if that ever does happen to me. Um, as far as like when I really started writing, like I don't know like when I wasn't writing, I guess. There was like a story that my mom wrote down when I was like 3 or 4 that I like dictated to her. I was like, Mom, I'm gonna tell you a story. Like write this down. It's a terrible story. But that's like basically like I started doing it when I was very young, and I like to joke that I'm a slow learner because it took me until I was like 37 until I actually sold a book, but I was trying for a while. Uh, yeah, I started like querying books back in my. I started querying a manuscript back in 2007, and I got an agent in 2013. So that took 6 years to get an agent, like multiple manuscripts. And then I had books go out on submission and die. So I finally got my book deal in 2019. So yeah, I think for me, it was just like something that I had always wanted to do from when I was like just that lonely little kid, just reading in a corner because it was an escape. And I wanted to be a person that could provide that escape. So I just kept going. And also, sometimes just writing itself feels like an escape because you get to make your own world and have people have problems in them and solve them. And it's great. And I love it.
Yeah, I I don't think I've ever not been a writer. Like my dad has like these folders of like stories from when I was like 3 and like 5 and 12 and 13. I think one story he showed me was from high school, and like it was like Sweet Valley High, but with black girls, and the boyfriend was like a serial killer. I don't know, it was really weird. Right? But yeah, I've always been a storyteller. Like but again, like sure, right? I thought I wanted to be an actor. Like I went to college and my whole undergrad major, like I doubled majored in bio and theater because I was like, I can't be a starving artist, so I'm gonna be a bio major too, and something will pop. And so it wasn't until after college that I figured out that what really drew me to theater and acting wasn't actually being in the role of the actor. It was creating the characters and the story and the worlds, because I took a few theater classes where we actually like dove into like theater history and just like narrative structure, and where we had to like actually replicate a play but from like an alternate like perspective. And I remember like doing my own like modern adaptation of Medea, which is a whole nother wild story. But I remember when I was writing that adaptation is when it dawned on me. It was my senior year, and I was like, I don't want to be an actor. What I want to do is be writing the stories and building up the worlds. And so post college that probably will never see the light of day. So post college, I was like, okay, I'm gonna do this for real. It was when I was in my huge like paranormal romance and urban fantasy like phase, which I never got out of it. But I was in it huge. And I was reading all of these things, and I was like, these are so good, but I really, really, really want to see more of like Black women featured in these stories. And so, true to form, I use any excuse to like make a big shiny purchase. I went and bought a MacBook. And I was like, I'm gonna try to be a writer. And I was like, that's my excuse to drop this money on his MacBook, because I'm gonna use it to try to be a writer. And so I remember my first story that I attempted to write was this like vampire novel back in like 2009. And it was my first time staring at a page and being like, how the hell do you get 90 to 100,000 plus words down? It was wild to me. And I was like, and then I was like, I'm never going to be a writer, because how the hell am I ever going to write that much? And so I remember like putting it down and then coming back a few months later and then just like having fun with telling the story from beginning to end. I think I got to like 60K. And then me being like, okay, I have to figure out how to like increase my stamina and like and like turn out a longer manuscript. So I wrote a couple of different things after that, just practicing how do you tell a story from beginning to end and like make like the plot stretch through and still feel like, I guess, like everything in there matters. The story that I queried was not an adult fantasy. It was a YA Hades and Persephone retelling, where true to form, my Persephone figure, she is like the rainbow girl that goes dark and murdery by the end of the story. But it died on sub. A very quick death. And I started writing the blood trials before that ever went on sub. When I was waiting for I sent the YA off to my agent, and I was waiting on her to respond, and so I wouldn't just like go completely just like insane, like just with my nerves and my anxiety and waiting on her response. I was like, I'm gonna write a new book, because then I'm like, if she says no, because it was a revise and resubmit offer, I was like, I at least will feel better about it, because I'm already working on the next thing that I can query too. And my agent just ended up offering rep off the YA, didn't sell, and we got to revising the blood trials, and that did sell. And the blood trials is funny, because the blood trials is the one story that it's the one time I just drowned out all the background noise as far as like what's trendy and what's not, and what publishing says will sell and what quote unquote won't sell. And I legitimately just like tossed every element that I like as a reader into that, which is how it ended up being like this mashup blend between like sci-fi and fantasy and a little bit of a mystery thrown in. I was like, I want a Black woman who is badass and who is like physically powerful, but also allowed to be vulnerable emotionally. And I was like, I like blood magic, so she needs to have that in there. And I want there to be sex in there, so we're gonna figure out a way to toss in some sex in this fantasy too. And I wanted this like big like globe spanning war, and so I'm like, okay, we're gonna figure out a way to like sprinkle this in. So I don't read. I've learned to stay away from reviews, but one review that I came across that was actually really nice commented on how like all of the world building elements in the blood trials and the blood gift feel like intentional. And I was like, oh, thank you, because I did. And like that was something I actually worked incredibly hard at, to make all of the little like I guess character details and like plot twists and like the different details you find out about the different worlds and magics and like lands. Like I wanted to build this world that was kind of like Avatar: The Last Airbender, where there's been like years and years and years of like wars and feuds and political clashes and histories between different peoples, and all of that past drama is now informing the conflict in the present.
Well, thank you all so much for discussing these amazing books. I have the links for all of the books in the description box below. So definitely please make sure that you add them to your TBR and pick them up, and await the last book of the Unbroken, the Faithless, and the next book with us all as well. Join us. And thank you all to the authors. Thank you everyone in the chat. Sorry for not getting to all of the questions, but thank you just everyone. And I hope you all have a really great rest of your day.
Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you.